Seasons in the Abyss. There are a lot of folks that actually say that this is the last great Slayer album, and while that's not totally true, this is certainly the last from the opening five, the great era of Slayer. Myself personally, whenever it comes to these discs, this is the point in time in which things go from being automatic to really up in question, where it seems that Slayer's material has deteriorated to a point where it was kind of wavery whether or not you were going to get a solid effort from the boys, either that or if it was just going to sound a little bit recycled and a little bit overdone. Unlike South of Heaven, Seasons in the Abyss decided to combine some of the reference points from Rain and Blood and also from South of Heaven itself. So the real result that you got from this album was an intermixing and intermingling and a real collection that boasted both elements of Slayer's sound. The hard aggression, not to mention the frantic guitar solos and just insane work, was able to combine with other aspects heard on South of Heaven with the slower tempos and the more cerebral direct approach with the cleanliness of the vocals, either that or the cleanliness overall to it. However, War Ensemble, right whenever you get going, is an instant Slayer classic. Its lyrical content certainly boasts that. And it's one that is direct and almost like a screaming missile that is aimed directly at the listener's head. But in reality, this missile misses the listener whatsoever, or in all points whatsoever, and instead is aiming it at everybody else. It's one that definitely has a lot of bite to it. And it gets this off on the right foot. Remember how important that I lauded the songs Angel of Death and Raining Blood on Rain and Blood, and how those bookends crafted a classic almost by themselves. A song such as War Ensemble already boasts that this album was going to have just a solid introduction, and at all points after this, you're going to be excited about what was really going to be presented. It was just a direct assault. But then you move on to songs such as Dead Skin Mask and Skeletons of Society that really showcase the cerebral nature that was exhibited on an album such as South of Heaven. And it's just a really great mix. It's the way in which this works so well is that they took the best characteristics from both Rain and Blood and South of Heaven in order to craft Seasons in the Abyss, and really were also on top of their songwriting game, something that some people said that on South of Heaven was a little bit skewed and perhaps was not as tight-knit as was heard on Rain and Blood in all points prior to that, even with the difference of sound. These are songs in Skeletons of Society and Dead Skin Mask that cerebral nature really works to the band's favor, and they still have the option and opportunity to use that direct nature to influence and introduce guitar solos and other forms of harder edge Rain and Bloodisms, so to speak, in order to really drive the point home. Almost as though tailoring the tracks to a little bit of the South of Heaven outlook while adding the capabilities of an Angel of Death or a Rain and Blood. Other songs on this disc really display more of a one or the other approach. However, the one thing that is universally constant on this is the fact that the songwriting is definitely at a high level. This is a collection of tracks that still maintains itself as absolutely classic in the eyes of a lot of people. And Phil Anselmo by himself considers this to be one of the best metal albums that he's ever heard. And that's definitely saying something, considering this, like Rain and Blood, has been able to really influence a lot of folks after the fact. Now, the title track off of this album is very noted. This is one that had a video that was seen on MTV. In fact, it's one that you could see on Beavis and Butthead. So Slayer was able to really break into the mainstream even further with this album and started to get a lot more recognition. It was no longer just based around the fact that Rain and Blood was this loudest album of all time, or was evil sounding. It wasn't because South of Heaven is just downright satanic. To be honest, whenever it comes to critical praise or critical attention, some folks actually considered this album a sort of weird form of self-parody, which is a strange way to still deliver an A- rating to an album. Myself personally, I consider this album to be one of Slayer's best. It's one that has all of the talent and skill level that really showcased Slayer's ability to be competent songwriters that were not all about speed and ferocity, which is a side in which they would, of course, really grow to try to cater a little bit more toward as their career progressed, but with so many people kind of expecting the next Rain and Blood or wanting this or wanting that, it's understandable that it can sometimes be lost within the wakes. For example, Jeff Hanneman was the individual that would pen a future album from the band that we'll talk about, and it ends up, with all of his genius, it ends up being probably one of the weakest of the bunch. It's just kind of an example of how some experiments work and others really don't. But with Seasons in the Abyss, its classic nature is based around not only the heavy riffing, but the solid songwriting, but also just the fact that the band seemed to be at its pinnacle point. One where 5 albums in, they still really haven't had an actual miss in their catalog. It's something that was not really going to change right away, but instead was going to sort of diminish in value as we move through the 1990s. This was a decade where Slayer's output seemed to really take a bit of a different twist and turn, which for some worked very nicely, but for others it was more of a confusion point than a stimulation point. We're going to get started by talking about those, and we're going to be doing that next, so you're not going to want to miss it. Stay tuned.